The morning light filtered through the narrow ER windows, muted by rain streaks on the glass. The ward smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a subtle tension threading through the air as the overnight staff handed over their notes. Nurses moved briskly between patients, voices low but purposeful, the hum of monitors blending with the soft clatter of trays and carts. She moved among them with quiet efficiency, adjusting an oxygen mask here, checking a blood pressure cuff there. Her presence was almost invisible, the kind of nurse everyone assumed was competent but unremarkable. The staff called her by her first name only in passing, assuming her role as just another cog in the hospital machinery. Yet, every movement she made carried a weight of observation, as if she catalogued every exit, every blind spot, every potential danger that might arise in the chaos of an ER. A gurney rattled down the hallway, wheels scraping against tile, and she instinctively tilted her head, noting the angle and the speed. The nurse pushing it cursed under his breath, fumbling with the sheets, while she moved alongside, silently correcting the positioning, guiding him with a tilt of her hand. No words, just a measured adjustment, small, precise, and unnoticed. In the corner, a young nurse fumbled with a new 4 setup, spilling saline on the floor. Most would have simply muttered or reprimanded, but she stepped over calmly, adjusted the tube, and returned to her own station without a word. No one stopped to acknowledge it. It was routine in the ER, yet there was a meticulousness in her eyes, a quiet awareness of far more than just medical procedure. At a glance, she looked like any other nurse, scrubs, hair tied back, badge pinned neatly on her chest. But she watched, not just the patients, but the staff, the doors, the hallways. Her gaze lingered on corners, calculating angles of movement, mentally noting weak points in traffic, obstacles, and escape routes. She was alert, but not anxious. Calm, deliberate. A call came over the intercom, a trauma patient en route, gunshot wound, ETA 5 minutes. The ER staff flinched at the urgency, but she simply adjusted her gloves, straightened her posture, and stepped toward the trauma bay. As others rushed to prepare, she surveyed the room again, noting the locations of everyone present, the nearest exits, and the path the incoming gurney would take. Every detail absorbed, catalogued, and ready for action. A moment of silence settled over the ward, a lull before the inevitable storm of activity. The staff worked quickly, voices overlapping, trays clattering, monitors beeping. She moved among them, silent but commanding. It wasn't authority granted by title or years of tenure, it was authority projected through competence, calm judgment, and a precision that went unnoticed because it wasn't flashy. The rain tapped against the windows harder, matching the distant wail of sirens outside. The ER felt alive and tense, oblivious to the fact that the quiet nurse everyone assumed was just part of the background would soon become the pivot on which the day, perhaps even lives, would turn. She adjusted a monitor, checked a line, then paused mid-step, glancing toward the entrance. Something in the rhythm of the hallways felt off. Not dangerous, not yet, but unfamiliar. The kind of small anomaly only someone trained to notice patterns would register. Her fingers lightly brushed a nearby tray as she walked past, a subtle, almost subconscious check of surroundings. No one paid her any mind. That was exactly how it should be. Her calm, her watchfulness, her quiet competence, all unnoticed. For now. The trauma bay still smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline from the previous rush, but the ER had begun to settle into a brittle rhythm. Monitors beeped steadily, patients groaned softly, and staff moved efficiently, though their energy was taut, frayed from the unrelenting pace. The quiet nurse moved among them, her steps measured, eyes sweeping the room, noting the subtle shifts that most overlooked. A delivery cart rattled down the hall, but something felt off. The order was unusually large, more than the ER typically required for a single shift. She stepped closer, examining the contents without touching, noting the unfamiliar packaging and the hurried handwriting on the labels. A junior nurse noticed her pause and frowned, assuming she was overreacting. She said nothing, merely catalogued the anomaly in her mind. In the corner, a patient thrashed lightly in a bed, murmuring about shadows and noises. The attending nurse approached, muttering about the stress of the day. But the quiet nurse's attention lingered on the pattern, the timing of his agitation, the unusual angle of his gaze, the way he flinched toward the hallway. It wasn't paranoia, it was anticipation, the kind that comes from training to read movement and intent in seconds. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Staff assumed it was routine check-ins, but she registered the pace and cadence, too controlled to be casual, too deliberate to be ordinary. She glanced at the ER doors and mentally mapped their points of entry, noting which locks were engaged and which relied solely on standard protocol. The intercom crackled faintly with garbled instructions. Another anomaly, the communication came from the wrong department, using terminology not standard to hospital procedure. She didn't announce it. She didn't raise alarm. Instead, she took mental notes, adjusting her position near the patients who were most vulnerable, subtly creating lines of sight and movement without drawing attention. A paramedic wheeled in another patient, sweating, pale, and shaking. He muttered that the streets were weird tonight, leaving it at that. Staff nodded politely, ignoring his unease. The quiet nurse listened, noting the inflection in his voice, the tension in his posture. Something was different. Something was off. She moved between beds, checking vitals, administering medications, and quietly adjusting equipment. Her hands moved with calm precision, each action deliberate, controlled, almost rehearsed. The staff around her were busy, unaware of her scanning the room for patterns and threats. Her gaze lingered briefly at the security cameras above the ER doors, reading angles and blind spots as if they were part of her own field of vision. Every little inconsistency, the unusual delivery, the odd footsteps, the paramedic's tension, stacked quietly in her mind. None of it warranted panic, not yet. But the feeling was undeniable, a storm was approaching. She could feel it in the rhythm of movement, in the nervous energy that no one else acknowledged. For now, she remained calm, a quiet constant in the subtle chaos. Her competence went unnoticed, her observations invisible to those around her. But she was ready, and she knew that when the situation escalated, the assumptions everyone held about her would be shattered. The ER hummed along, ordinary and unaware, while the quiet nurse tightened her mental grip on every detail. Something was coming. Something that would demand everything she had practiced, everything she had restrained herself from showing. And when it arrived, they would discover just how wrong they had been. The calm in the ER fractured with a sound that pierced through the hum of monitors, the metallic scrape of the double doors swinging open, followed by shouts that didn't belong in a hospital. Staff froze mid-step, glancing toward the entrance, unsure whether it was an emergency or a miscommunication. A group of masked intruders had stormed in, their movements precise, aggressive, and clearly premeditated. The first figure pushed a gurney aside as if it were nothing more than furniture. The quiet nurse's eyes narrowed subtly. Her body shifted, almost imperceptibly, positioning herself between the staff and the incoming threat. Screams erupted from a nearby room as a terrified patient clutched a pillow like a shield. One of the intruders barked a command, demanding compliance from anyone in the ER. The staff froze, paralyzed by shock and disbelief. Phones dropped to the floor, carts toppled, and monitors beeped in erratic rhythm as the room descended into chaos. She didn't move with haste or panic. Instead, she scanned the room systematically, taking in the positions of every person, every piece of furniture, every potential hazard. Her hands were bare, unarmed, yet her presence carried a quiet authority no one fully recognized. "Everyone stay low," she instructed, voice steady, clipped, barely audible above the confusion. A few staff members hesitated. She didn't repeat herself. The command hung in the air, unassuming but impossible to ignore. Slowly, nurses and doctors dropped behind counters and beds, following the direction she had set. The intruders began moving through the ward, checking rooms, scanning faces. One approached a patient in a bed near the hallway. The staff member frozen beside the bed flinched. Without a word, the quiet nurse stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front, her posture rigid but calm. The intruder paused, noting her composure. He misjudged it as a lack of experience, but in that brief hesitation, she had already calculated escape routes, potential obstacles, and the best positions for the staff to avoid harm. A nurse whispered, "She's just a nurse, right?" But her words were swallowed by the chaos. It didn't matter. The quiet nurse continued to move strategically, guiding staff silently, ensuring patients were shielded, monitoring the intruder's patterns. Every instruction was concise, every gesture deliberate. A gunshot echoed, a warning, not aimed at anyone, but enough to send the ER staff sprawling to the floor. Her hand lifted, signaling a group of nurses toward a safer corner, then another toward the supply room. No one argued. No one questioned. Her authority was assumed, unspoken, manifested purely through precision and calm under pressure. The intruders split into two teams, moving faster, scanning faster, more aggressive. The quiet nurse assessed the threats in seconds, her mind mapping contingencies, which doors could be blocked, which hallways provided cover, how to minimize exposure for both staff and patients. Her presence became the anchor in the storm. Through the haze of panic, she moved with almost imperceptible fluidity, shifting a bed here, guiding a patient there, adjusting equipment to serve as makeshift cover. Each action was small, almost mundane, but collectively they created barriers, slowed the intruder's advance, and bought precious seconds. For the staff, it was disorienting. Their assumptions about her, that she was quiet, unremarkable, harmless, began to fracture. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flamboyant, she didn't display force. But the effect she had on the ER, the way she managed chaos, was undeniable. The intruders paused near the central nurse's station, scanning the room for resistance. She positioned herself in line with the main exit, silent and observant, anticipating their next move. Each second stretched, heavy with tension, the noise of alarms and screaming patients swelling around her. She was calm. Focused. Ready. And though no one in the ER realized it yet, this quiet, understated nurse, the one they had assumed was just part of the background, was about to change the entire course of the crisis. The intruders split, moving with mechanical precision down parallel corridors. Panic radiated from the staff, but the quiet nurse remained anchored, her stance deliberate, scanning the approaching threats with cold calculation. Every movement, every sound was logged in her mind, the rhythm of footsteps, the direction of weapons, the reaction time of staff scattered around her. A nurse stumbled over a gurney near the trauma bay. One of the intruders noticed and advanced, shouting commands. The nurse froze, panic flashing in her eyes. The quiet nurse stepped forward, just enough to be seen, her hands raised not in surrender but to indicate calm. "Move behind the counter," she said, voice low and measured. The nurse obeyed instantly, guided by the certainty in her tone. The intruder glanced at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his masked face. He assumed she was inexperienced. She didn't flinch, didn't respond to the challenge. Instead, she adjusted her stance subtly, angling her body to shield the staff behind her while keeping the intruder within sight. In that instant, she was a pivot, not aggressive, but in total command of the space between threat and patient. A gun rattled on a nearby cart. Staff screamed and ducked, some dropping equipment in their haste. She scanned the layout, noting the obstacles, the potential paths for the intruder, and the safest routes for staff. With minimal gestures, she guided them into cover, subtly positioning each person without drawing attention to herself. One intruder lunged toward a supply room, dragging a frightened orderly with him. She moved along the corridor, her approach silent but assertive, creating pressure through presence rather than force. The intruder turned toward her, assessing. She didn't meet his gaze aggressively, she simply stood firm, her composure unshakable. The intruder hesitated. That brief pause, a fraction of a second, was enough for the orderly to slip free behind a counter. Staff glanced at her, confusion in their eyes. Something about her movements, her calm decisiveness, suggested more than just nursing experience. But no one dared question it, not amidst the gunfire and chaos. Her authority was silent, earned through action alone. A second intruder approached from the opposite hallway, weapon raised. She shifted weight slightly, calculating angles, her fingers brushing a fire extinguisher. She didn't strike, didn't shout, just adjusted the positioning of herself and nearby staff to block lines of sight, guiding everyone into safer spots. The intruder misjudged the space and hesitated, uncertain now of how much control she possessed. She moved to the trauma bay, checking on the patient brought in earlier. The man was conscious but panicked, his vitals spiking. She stabilized his fore without a word, keeping him calm with gentle but precise movements. Nearby staff followed her guidance instinctively, instinct forged from the quiet authority she projected. The intruders regrouped, exchanging terse words. Their confidence was unshaken, they had assumed chaos would bend the staff to fear. Instead, the quiet nurse was bending the chaos, channeling it with invisible hands. Staff were safer, patients calmer, lines of escape clearer, all without a single raised voice beyond necessary commands. A third intruder attempted to push through the main entrance to reach the nurse's station. She intercepted him silently, positioning herself in the doorway. She didn't block aggressively, she merely created an obstacle he could not ignore, projecting control through body language and calm precision. He tried to shove past, but her stance, her awareness, her quiet assertion of space forced him to stop, reevaluate. The ER staff, still shocked and terrified, began to notice. Whispers passed between them, "Who is she? I've never seen her move like that." But she didn't answer. Recognition was not her goal. Her goal was containment, preservation of life, and maintaining control of the room without escalating violence unnecessarily. A distant alarm blared, reinforcements, perhaps, or a signal from security. The intruders glanced toward it, distracted, buying her precious seconds to reposition the staff and stabilize the environment. She moved quickly, checking lines of sight, moving a gurney to block one hallway, guiding a nurse to hold a door, adjusting monitors and equipment to create safe zones. The intruders were aggressive, trained, and confident. She was calm, methodical, and utterly competent. And in that tension-filled space, it became evident, she was not simply a nurse. Her authority did not come from title or rank, it came from experience, precision, and an unspoken command that no one in the ER had anticipated. The first confrontation ended not with violence, but with order imposed quietly amid chaos. Staff were alive, patients were safer, and the intruders, though still a threat, were beginning to respect, if only subconsciously, that the quiet nurse was a force they had underestimated. And though no one spoke it aloud, a subtle shift had occurred. The assumptions that had anchored the ER staff, that she was ordinary, unremarkable, were crumbling. The storm had only just begun, but the first wave had already revealed the depth of her competence. The ER had settled into a tense equilibrium. The intruders had paused, regrouping at opposite ends of the ward, their movements cautious now, wary of the quiet nurse whose composure seemed unshakable. Staff clung to corners, eyes darting between patients and the masked figures, unsure how to act. She stood near the center of the room, taking in the entire layout in a single sweep. Every door, every cart, every piece of equipment became part of her mental map. Patients' positions, staff locations, lines of sight, all registered instantly. Her hands moved methodically, adjusting IVs, stabilizing patients, and moving small pieces of equipment to serve as barriers without anyone realizing their tactical purpose. "Secure the hallway," she said softly, directing a young orderly to position a gurney to block the intruder's path. He hesitated, glancing at the intruder nearby. Her gaze met his, steady, unwavering. Without another word, he moved, placing the gurney exactly where she intended. The barrier was subtle, non-confrontational, but effective. The intruders began advancing again, more aggressively this time. One of them gestured toward a patient who had begun to cry out. The quiet nurse stepped forward, her voice still low but firm. "Stay down. Do not move." Her words carried authority, not shouted, not threatening, just absolute certainty. The patient froze, the intruder's attention flicked to her. She moved along the corridor, silently directing staff into safer positions, subtly using body language and precise gestures. A nurse holding an unconscious patient was positioned behind a counter. Another nurse clutched a chart, crouching behind a gurney as instructed. Every move she made minimized exposure to danger, creating invisible lines of control across the room. One intruder advanced toward the nurse's station, rifle raised. She shifted slightly, stepping into his line of sight without overt aggression. Her calm projection, the way she occupied the space, forced him to pause. In that instant, she assessed the environment, the nearest exits, potential choke points, and improvised cover. Without raising her voice further, she gestured to a nearby nurse to hold a door partially closed, creating a subtle barrier. The intruder hesitated, frustrated but cautious. A monitor beeped sharply, drawing attention to the trauma bay. The patient brought in earlier had spiked in vitals, the kind of complication that could collapse the ER's fragile order. She moved without haste, assessing the situation, adjusting medication lines, and stabilizing the patient. Each action was calm, deliberate, and precise. Staff followed her movements instinctively, unsure why but compelled by her presence. Another intruder attempted to separate two staff members, forcing them into the hallway. She intercepted, positioning herself strategically between the intruder and her colleagues. She did not confront aggressively, instead, her posture, her awareness, and the precision of her movements created a psychological barrier. The intruder misjudged the space and slowed his advance, unsure how to proceed without escalating too early. In the chaos, she coordinated a silent network of protection, directing staff to shield patients, using carts and beds as cover, stabilizing lines of sight, and subtly controlling the flow of movement. No one outside the ER would have recognized it, but within seconds, the entire ward was being managed as though by an unseen tactician. Her actions began to shift the balance. The intruders, though still threatening, were being funneled into predictable paths. Their aggression was contained, not by force but by her calculated influence. Staff whispered among themselves, astonished. "I've never seen her like this, how does she know what to do?" One nurse glanced at her in disbelief, catching only a hint of the authority she exuded. A third intruder attempted to flank the main corridor. She anticipated the movement instantly, redirecting a nurse and a patient into a safer area without alerting the intruder to the shift. Her calm decisiveness denied them the chaos they had expected to exploit. Through it all, she remained understated. No shouting, no theatrics, no sudden violence. Her authority was subtle, built on precise positioning, quiet commands, and the absolute confidence of someone trained to assess, anticipate, and control without panic. For the first time, the staff recognized that the assumptions they had clung to, that she was quiet, unremarkable, ordinary, were false. Every decision she made demonstrated skill far beyond what her role as a nurse would suggest. It was discipline, anticipation, and strategic thinking, a tactical mind operating under pressure, cloaked in the calm of everyday routine. The intruders, sensing the shift, paused again. They had expected fear. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they found composure, precision, and unspoken authority, the quiet nurse who had been invisible until now. The ER, though still under threat, was no longer in freefall. The staff moved more confidently, guided by her silent hand. Patients were calmer, partially shielded, and the chaos that had threatened to overwhelm the ward was beginning to yield to a structure only she could impose. And in that moment, the quiet nurse's competence was no longer subtle. It was clear, undeniable, and commanding, yet still restrained, still measured, still unassuming. The intruders had realized too late that they were no longer operating in a room of panic. They were operating in her space, on her terms, and every step they took was anticipated, accounted for, and contained. The tactical shift had occurred. The quiet nurse was no longer just a nurse. She had become the fulcrum of the ER, the anchor in the storm, and the unrecognized authority around which survival now depended. The ER's tension had transformed from disarray into a fragile, controlled chaos, with the quiet nurse at its center. The intruders, sensing the increasing resistance, became more aggressive. One moved toward the trauma bay, dragging a frightened orderly behind him. Another circled the main corridor, testing lines of sight, trying to flank staff who had started following her subtle guidance. The stakes had risen, every second counted, every misstep could cost lives. She moved calmly among them, her steps measured, almost invisible, yet every motion reshaped the battlefield. A nurse carrying an oxygen tank froze as the intruder approached. Without hesitation, the quiet nurse stepped between them, tilting her body to shield both staff and patient while maintaining a line of sight on the threat. Her presence alone slowed the intruder, forcing him to pause and reconsider. In the trauma bay, the earlier patient's condition worsened. Monitors screamed with alarms, and a junior doctor panicked. She moved silently to the bed, adjusted the 4 and oxygen, checked vitals, and stabilized the patient. She gave no explanation, no lecture, only precision, competence, and calm authority. The staff watched, some whispering in disbelief, unable to grasp how effortlessly she balanced the medical crisis and the ongoing threat. From the hallway came the metallic clatter of dropped weapons and a shout from an intruder frustrated by her maneuvers. She adjusted positions quickly, using furniture and medical equipment to create temporary barriers, forcing the intruders into predictable paths. One intruder tried to block her movement, but she sidestepped smoothly, subtly guiding him toward a corner where he could do no harm without realizing he had been funneled there. A nurse whispered, "I don't understand, how is she doing all this?" Another nodded, eyes wide. It wasn't just skill, it was awareness, anticipation, and the ability to calculate multiple outcomes in seconds. Her competence radiated outward, yet she remained unobtrusive, never raising her voice beyond necessity. The intruders began to coordinate their actions, trying to overwhelm the ward. One yelled, demanding staff compliance, while another dragged a patient into a side room. She anticipated the next move, signaling subtly to a nurse to hold the door partially closed, creating a bottleneck that slowed them. Another nurse instinctively followed her lead, blocking a corridor to prevent intrusion. The quiet nurse's mind moved faster than the chaos around her. Every decision balanced risk against preservation, a life in one corner, a panic-prone staff member in another. She calculated the intruder's potential reactions, adjusting positions and actions without confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Her restraint was a weapon, her calm authority the shield protecting everyone around her. At one point, an intruder raised a weapon, aiming toward the trauma bay. She remained still, assessed angles, and moved with the smallest, most controlled shift, enough to obscure line of sight and protect the patient without engaging violently. The intruder's aim faltered, and he backed off, frustrated. That single act of quiet competence prevented a potential catastrophe. The staff, now beginning to grasp the extent of her capability, moved with renewed confidence. Patients were shielded, staff were guided efficiently, and the intruder's aggression was met not with brute force but with calculated, anticipatory control. She maintained constant observation, watching every corridor, anticipating every movement, and subtly shaping the flow of action. A sudden, sharp alarm echoed through the ER, the hospital's internal security system triggered, signaling that backup might be arriving. The intruder's attention fractured, and she exploited the split-second distraction to reposition staff and patients, maintaining safety while her presence silently asserted command over the space. One intruder tried a desperate maneuver, rushing a nurse toward the central hallway. She intercepted with minimal motion, forcing him to adjust his path without a struggle. She didn't strike. She didn't shout. The intruder's frustration mounted, while her calculated control went unnoticed by those who had expected panic. Through all this, her restraint never wavered. She didn't escalate unnecessarily, she didn't seek recognition, and she never let fear dictate her movements. Every choice carried weight, the risk to her own safety was constant, yet unacknowledged. This quiet, invisible authority was the linchpin keeping the ER from collapsing under the pressure of escalating threats. As the intruders became increasingly desperate, the ER staff began to trust her guidance implicitly. She moved like a silent conductor, orchestrating responses, positioning staff and patients, and containing the chaos with a level of precision and calm that seemed almost unnatural, yet it was nothing more than skill honed by experience and discipline. By the end of the escalation, the ward was still dangerous, but no longer in freefall. Lives had been preserved. Panic had been contained. The intruders, though still present, were now navigating a space meticulously controlled by someone they had underestimated completely. The quiet nurse had not fought them with violence but with command, awareness, and unwavering composure. In the storm's eye, she remained calm. The staff recognized her skill now, though still partially in disbelief. The intruders were still a threat, but the balance had shifted. Control, precision, and quiet authority had turned the tide. And through it all, she paid a silent price: constant vigilance, every second measured, every decision weighted with potential loss. The moral burden of leadership was already settling on her shoulders, unacknowledged but heavy. The ER was a controlled storm of tension. The intruders had grown more desperate, their movements sharp and unpredictable. Staff huddled behind counters, some clutching patients, others gripping equipment as makeshift protection. The quiet nurse moved between them, every step deliberate, calculating, observing. Every second held consequences that could not be undone. Through the chaos, she spotted an intruder attempting to drag a patient toward a side exit. A shot rang out, grazing a wall beside them. Staff froze. Panic threatened to spread. She assessed quickly: intercepting aggressively could provoke violence and risk the patient, holding back could allow the intruder to escape with a hostage. Her mind calculated probabilities, weighing outcomes with surgical precision. She chose restraint. Slowly, deliberately, she positioned herself between the intruder and the patient, adjusting her stance, projecting calm authority. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She allowed her presence, her control of the environment, and her precise positioning to influence the intruder's behavior. He hesitated. The pause was brief, but in that moment, the patient slipped to safety behind a cart, guided by a young nurse she had subtly directed. The quiet nurse's decision came at a cost. In that split second, she exposed herself to the intruder, a calculated risk. He glanced at her, confused by her confidence, his aim wavering. Another intruder from the opposite hallway noticed her and moved closer, but her awareness was instantaneous. She adjusted her position to maintain control, shielding staff while keeping both threats in her peripheral vision. Nearby, a patient began to panic, struggling against restraints. A nurse was frozen, unsure how to intervene without escalating danger. The quiet nurse approached silently, placing a reassuring hand on the patient's shoulder while subtly directing the nurse to guide them behind cover. Calm, controlled, precise, every action a decision measured against moral weight and potential consequence. The intruders began coordinating again, more aggressively this time. She recognized a pattern: they intended to divide and overwhelm. Her choice was stark: engage physically and risk escalation, or continue containment and risk a prolonged standoff. She opted for minimal confrontation, relying on strategy and anticipation rather than force. Every movement was calculated, every gesture intentional. A stretcher blocked one corridor. She repositioned it subtly to channel the intruder's path away from vulnerable patients. A medical supply cart became cover, placed just so to limit their movement without drawing attention to its purpose. Staff followed her silent cues instinctively. The intruders advanced, frustrated, but the space itself had become a controlled zone, her zone. One intruder yelled, aiming a weapon toward the trauma bay. She held her position, adjusting the angle of a monitor to block line of sight without escalating the confrontation. Another patient cried out, but she maintained control, guiding them to safety with quiet authority. Staff began to recognize the pattern. Her decisions were never about bravado, never about dominating the intruders, but about preserving life and minimizing harm. The weight of leadership pressed down on her. Every choice carried moral implications. One wrong decision could mean injury or death. She moved carefully, aware of the lives in her hands. Her restraint was tested constantly, not by fear, but by responsibility. She paid attention to even the smallest details: a dropped instrument, a frightened hand, the direction of a gaze, the angle of a weapon. By choosing strategy over aggression, she limited casualties, protected staff, and maintained composure under pressure. Yet the cost was personal. Every heartbeat, every second required her full attention. There was no room for error, no margin for hesitation. The burden of her moral choice weighed silently on her shoulders. A brief lull fell over the ward. The intruders regrouped, evaluating the unexpected resistance. Staff whispered among themselves, their eyes following her movements. "She's incredible," one nurse said quietly. But there was no time for praise, no room for acknowledgement. Her authority was silent, earned through competence and judgment, not words or accolades. Even as the immediate threat seemed contained, the quiet nurse remained vigilant. Her decisions had protected lives, but the stakes were still high. The moral choice she had made, restraint over confrontation, had required exposure, risk, and constant calculation. She bore that weight alone, as always. And as the intruders paused, uncertain of their next move, she remained the anchor of the ER. Calm, decisive, and morally grounded. Her competence and quiet authority were now undeniable to all who had witnessed it, but she neither sought recognition nor relief. She simply continued to protect, to guide, and to endure the burden she had chosen. The intruders' patience had thinned. Frustration and aggression radiated from them in sharp, controlled movements. Their prior assumptions, that the ER would descend into chaos, had been shattered by the quiet nurse. She now controlled the space, and they knew it, though none could say exactly why. Every hallway, doorway, and patient bed had been silently assessed, secured, or used as a barrier under her guidance. One intruder lunged toward the trauma bay, attempting to drag a patient into the corridor. She intercepted instantly, not with violence, but by occupying the space strategically, tilting her posture, and directing him subtly with gestures. He froze, caught off guard by her composure and the impossibility of rushing past her. Another intruder attempted to flank the ER staff, but she anticipated the movement, quietly signaling a nurse to hold a door and subtly repositioning a gurney to restrict access. The calm authority she projected now held the intruders in check. Staff moved with quiet confidence, guided by her every action. Patients remained shielded, reassured by her presence rather than any words. Every small adjustment, every shift of furniture or patient, had a purpose: to contain, to protect, to control without escalation. One intruder raised a firearm toward a corridor, aiming toward staff hiding behind counters. She shifted slightly, placing herself within sight, but not directly threatening. Her body projected control and confidence. In response, the intruder's aim faltered. He backed down, frustrated and uncertain. Every motion she made was calculated, deliberate, precise, a blend of anticipation and restraint honed through experience. Another intruder attempted a direct confrontation near the nurse's station. She didn't react aggressively. Instead, she projected control through presence alone, subtly maneuvering staff and obstacles to funnel him into a corner with minimal risk to patients. The intruder's options narrowed, and in that instant, he realized the balance of power had shifted. A nurse whispered, barely audible over the beeping monitors, "She's guiding them without touching them." Another nodded, wide-eyed. The intruders, trained and confident, were now constrained by her quiet authority. It was not intimidation or force, it was precision, foresight, and unshakable composure. The trauma bay patient's condition worsened briefly. She moved between the patient and the threat without breaking her rhythm. IVs were adjusted, vitals monitored, oxygen levels stabilized. Staff followed her lead instinctively, performing tasks with silent efficiency, guided by her calm decisiveness. No words were wasted, every instruction was essential. The intruders attempted a final push. Their desperation was evident, but the quiet nurse anticipated their actions. She positioned herself strategically between their most likely paths and the vulnerable patients, adjusting staff and objects in subtle ways that created barriers without confrontation. A stretcher became a shield, a supply cart a choke point. Every movement denied the intruders any clear advantage. Minutes stretched into tense moments. Staff moved confidently under her silent direction. The intruders, though still dangerous, had no choice but to navigate the ER according to her unspoken rules. Every attempt to intimidate or advance was met not with aggression but with controlled redirection. Finally, the intruders faltered. Their coordination had been disrupted repeatedly, their options limited by her anticipation and quiet control. They exchanged frustrated gestures, their aggression stymied by a presence they had never accounted for. One backed toward the exit, realizing further action would risk capture or confrontation in a space entirely dominated by her strategic awareness. She did not chase them. She did not celebrate. She remained vigilant, ensuring staff and patients were safe, checking corridors, adjusting positions, and maintaining control. The ER was still tense, but the threat had been neutralized without unnecessary force, without spectacle, without chaos. The staff, watching in awe, realized the magnitude of her competence, though few fully understood how she had orchestrated it all. No words were exchanged, recognition was silent, earned, and understated. She returned to her routine tasks, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, and attending patients with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her from the beginning. The final confrontation had ended not with a dramatic showdown, but with calm authority, careful strategy, and unshakable restraint. The intruders had been contained, the ER stabilized, and lives preserved. And through it all, she had avoided the spotlight. Her strength was quiet, her authority earned in action, not applause. She had changed the course of the crisis, but she remained, as always, a nurse among nurses, disciplined, competent, and unassuming. The ER was quiet now, but not peaceful. Monitors beeped steadily, patients murmured softly, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. The intruders were gone, either escorted away by security or retreating under pressure, but the tension lingered like a heavy fog. Staff moved slowly, checking on patients, picking up dropped instruments, and tidying the disrupted space. She walked the corridors calmly, adjusting 4 lines, straightening blankets, and checking vitals. Every movement was precise, deliberate, and measured, the same quiet competence that had guided the ward through the crisis. Nurses and doctors glanced at her, some whispering about her actions, others simply watching, unsure how to articulate what they had witnessed. "I don't understand how she did it," a young nurse murmured to a colleague. "She just knew what to do," the colleague replied. Everything felt safer when she was around. She heard them but did not respond. Recognition was not her goal. She moved to the trauma bay, checking the patient whose vitals had spiked during the confrontation. Adjusting the oxygen and medication, she ensured the patient was stable. No one had been injured further. Lives were preserved. Her competence had made the difference. Security personnel arrived, surveying the ward and asking questions. She answered succinctly, providing facts without dramatics. She did not embellish, did not seek acknowledgement, and did not step forward as a hero. She simply guided them to relevant areas, her calm authority silently setting the tone for how the aftermath would be managed. Staff who had witnessed the events began to settle, though the memory of chaos lingered. Some offered tentative thanks, murmured praise, or simply nodded in quiet acknowledgement. She accepted none of it outwardly, continuing her rounds as though the crisis had been routine. Her work was never for recognition, it was for precision, control, and the lives dependent on it. In corners, colleagues whispered among themselves. "She handled it all," one said, voice low with awe. Another added, "I never realized she's more than just a nurse." But the truth of her identity remained unspoken. She had revealed competence, decisiveness, and authority without ever announcing herself. The recognition was there, subtle and indirect, earned in action and restraint. She paused by a monitor, adjusting settings, and then glanced toward the ER entrance. The storm had passed, but the vigilance remained. Even in calm, her awareness never faltered. She scanned the room one last time, noting positions, exits, and potential hazards. The responsibility of safety was constant, unrelenting. The staff slowly returned to normal routines, but the quiet nurse continued her work with understated efficiency. The crisis had passed, yet the ER's rhythm had changed. There was a newfound respect for the calm, unassuming presence that had orchestrated order during the chaos, but it remained quiet, subtle, unspoken. In the aftermath, she remained herself, disciplined, composed, and meticulous. The weight of responsibility lingered, as did the silent acknowledgement of her skill. No one cheered. No one demanded recognition. She had saved lives, preserved order, and exercised authority without spectacle, and that was enough. The ward settled. Patients were stable. Staff returned to their stations, murmuring quietly among themselves. The quiet nurse continued her rounds, every movement measured, every action precise. The ER had survived, and the unassuming center of its salvation remained calm, unremarked, and fully earned. The ER was silent now, save for the steady hum of monitors and the occasional soft beeps signaling stable vitals. The chaos of the crisis had passed, leaving only a residual tension that gradually dissolved as staff resumed their routines. She moved through the ward as she always did, calm, measured, invisible in her efficiency, attending to the smallest details. The patients were safe. Staff were recovering from adrenaline, reassessing their own roles and actions, whispering quietly about what had just unfolded. Yet, no one singled her out. There were no accolades, no clapping hands, no dramatic acknowledgments. Her work had been crucial, life-saving, and commanding, but the recognition was silent, subtle, indirect. She checked on the trauma bay one final time, ensuring monitors were stable, for lines correctly aligned, and the patient resting comfortably. A nurse approached, hesitating, as though about to speak, but then merely nodded and returned to her own station. She acknowledged the gesture with the faintest tilt of her head and continued her rounds, the weight of the day carried quietly on her shoulders. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting pale, uneven patterns across the floors. The ward smelled of antiseptic, coffee, and faint ozone from the emergency alarms that had finally ceased. The ER felt ordinary again, but the memory of the crisis lingered in the careful movements of everyone present. She paused at the nurse's station, adjusting a chart and straightening a pen. Her badge reflected the pale sunlight, but it meant nothing beyond identification. She had proven her competence in the storm, maintained control when chaos threatened to overwhelm, yet her role remained the same: nurse, caretaker, quiet observer. Authority had been exercised, but never flaunted. Recognition had been earned, but never sought. A junior nurse glanced at her, awe in their eyes. I've never seen anyone handle something like that," the nurse whispered. She offered no words in response, only a small, measured nod, allowing the silence to carry the acknowledgement. The lesson was imparted without spectacle: calm, competence, restraint, that was power. The ward resumed its rhythm. Patients slept, staff tidied, monitors beeped steadily. The quiet nurse moved among them seamlessly, her presence a constant yet unnoticed force of stability. Every action, every choice, every small intervention had ensured survival, order, and safety. The crisis had passed, but the mark of her authority lingered quietly in the restored calm. She walked to a window, looking out at the clearing sky. The sun touched the hospital walls in muted light. She did not smile. She did not seek gratitude. Her work had been done. Lives had been saved. Chaos had been controlled. And she remained, as always, a quiet force, disciplined, composed, competent, and unassuming. The ER was calm. The intruders gone. Patients safe. Staff alert but recovering. And the quiet nurse returned to her routine, her authority unquestioned, her presence understated, her work complete. No spotlight awaited her. None was desired. She had fulfilled her role perfectly, and that, in its own way, was everything. The ward moved on, as it always did. And she moved with it, silent, steady, and unshakable.